Good morning, my dear students. Welcome to a lecture on lyrical ballads. Lyrical ballads is a word, a term, a name that you're all familiar with because it immediately brings to our mind the idea of the Romantic Age. In order to understand and appreciate the Romantic Age, what you really need to do is first to have an idea of what the Romantic Age is all about. Remember, when we talk about the Romantic Age, we always say the Romantic Age in England began with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads in 1798. So, what exactly is the Romantic Age and what are the characteristics of the Romantic Age? 1798 to 1835 is the Romantic Age. The most important difference is that it was a total breakaway from the neoclassical age. Subjectivity, the poet moved away from the outside world to his own experiences. Any number of poems that you think of in the Romantic Age begins with I, my, I wandered lonely as a cloud, says Wordsworth. My heart leaps up, says Wordsworth. My heart aches, says Keats. And so we can go on and on with examples of how the Romantic Age poetry was basically subjective, not objective, not object-based like the poems of the neoclassical age. The second important characteristic is imagination. These poets believed that one has to fly on the flightless wings of poesy in order to be able to write good poetry. Look at the slide, my dear students, and you will see that these poets moved away from the drawing room of poems like Rape of the Lock to bonding with nature. It was the natural world, the beauty of nature, the hugeness of nature, the awe and wonder that nature inspired in them that attracted these poets. The language of the poems that these Romantic poets wrote was necessarily simple. They believed that since their themes dealt with common people, the language should also be that used by the common person, by the ordinary rustic folk of England of those days. In every poem, in fact, in every literary text, there is always a what and a how. What is the matter? What is the theme? And the how is the manner, is the language, is the style. To the Romantic poets, what they said was much more important than how they said it. One must have looked at the beauty of the Lake County, which Wordsworth and Coleridge travelled on. I want you to have a glimpse of this beautiful landscape of the England countryside where most of the poems were written, thought of, and you have the two poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, there. When we talk of the lyrical ballads, we necessarily need to talk about two writers. The writers, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. William Wordsworth was poet laureate and lived for a long, long time, 80 years, 1770 to 1850. My dear students, you may remember that the French Revolution and the ideas of liberty, fraternity that started in that period was a great influence on the Romantic poets. Wordsworth was inspired by the zeal of brotherhood and mankind. This political zeal also led to literary reform. Remember, I've already mentioned to you how the poems of Wordsworth are very different from the poems that Pope wrote, from the poems of the neoclassical age. In the Romantic poets, there was a psychological curiosity. They were interested in what was happening in the mind of the poet when he wrote his poems. Remember Coleridge's famous theory of fancy and imagination. Remember Coleridge talking about primary and secondary imagination. It is the same psychological curiosity that inspired poets like Wordsworth. The prime concern in most of his poems, you will notice, is the dignity of humblest lives. He bonded with nature, and this is best seen in poems like Tintern Abbey and The Prelude. Unless one hears the poems, my dear students, one does not really understand the greatness of these poets. Can I read to you a few lines from The Prelude, where Wordsworth says, "With a heart joyous, nor scared at its own liberty, I look about. And should the chosen guide be nothing better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way. I breathe again. Trances of thought and mountings of the mind come fast upon me. It is shaken off, that burden of my own unnatural self, the heavy weight of many a weary day, not mine, and such as were not made for me." It is this influence of nature that inspires Wordsworth to write poem after poem. Let me read to you a beautiful poem when we want to see the influence of nature. All of us know the poem, "I wandered lonely as a cloud." What is this great influence that nature has upon a poet like Wordsworth? Let me quote the last verse from this poem. "For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils." The spirit of nature that one sees, look at the slide, my dear students. The spirit of nature, in Wordsworth's own words, "And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with joy, of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime, of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man." What does he find in the mind of man? A motion, a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Wordsworth admits to the influence of nature in his life, in his mind, in his thoughts. It is that which impels him to act. The second important poet when we talk about the Romantic Age, the first generation of the Romantic Age, and more importantly when we think about the Lyrical Ballads, the second important poet is, of course, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834. In quite a great contrast to Wordsworth, Coleridge was interested in the supernatural. When you think of poems like Christabel and the Ancient Mariner, you will notice that the supernatural is present to a great extent in most of his poems. I'm thinking of a poem like Christabel, and again, I would like to read a few lines to you. The poem goes, towards the end of the poem, "A snake's small eye blinks dull and shy, and the lady's eyes, they shrunk in her head. Each shrunk up to a serpent's eye, and with somewhat of malice and more of dread, as Christabel she looked askance. One moment, and the sight was fled. But Christabel in dizzy trance, stumbling on the unsteady ground, shuddered aloud with a hissing sound, and Geraldine again turned, and like a thing that sought relief, full of wonder and full of grief, she rolled her large bright eyes divine wildly on Sir Leoline." You remember the story of Christabel, how there is this devilish woman who comes in the role, in the garb of a beautiful woman. When we talk of Coleridge, my dear students, look at the slide. The next poem that you have to think of is Kubla Khan. The Ancient Mariner, of course, is a long poem, but Kubla Khan is a much shorter poem. And I want you to remember that Coleridge was supposed to have written this poem under the influence of opium. It's a beautiful poem where he attempts to describe the grandness of this palace that Kublai Khan built. The poem begins very grandly with a beautiful description, but then somewhere along the line, Coleridge, who was under the influence of opium, comes out of that drugged effect, and the poem remains an unfinished poem. Kublai Khan is an unfinished poem, but even as an unfinished poem, I think it's a great poem. Let me read to you a few lines of Kublai Khan. You may be wondering, where is the Lyrical Ballads? My dear students, this is preparatory to our understanding of the Lyrical Ballads. But oh, I'm reading from the Kublai Khan. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ever beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermitted burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's fail, and amid these dancing rocks at once, and ever it flung up momently the sacred river. And so on and on goes the description. Kublai Khan, one of the most well-known poems of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge also contributed a great deal to literary criticism of the age. Coleridge's great work, Biographia Literaria, is something that we have to remember when we think of the Romantic Manifesto. Let me read to you a few lines from Coleridge. What is the importance that nature has in his life? O lady, we receive but what we give, and in our life alone does nature live. Ours is the wedding garment, ours her shroud, and would we aught behold of higher worth, a light, a glory, a fair luminous cloud enveloping the earth, and from the soul itself must be sent a sweet and potent voice of its own birth, of all sweet sounds, the life and element. Let us look at the Lyrical Ballads. Let us look at the 3 editions of the Lyrical Ballads. I shall also be talking to you about the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. But the title itself, the Lyrical Ballads. When one looks at the word lyric, one remembers that the origin of the word had to do something with the lyre. Some of you might recall that there were 2 kinds of music, 2 kinds of poems in ancient Greece. And the lyric was a kind of poetry which could be sung to the accompaniment of a lyre. L-Y-R-E, my dear students, and not L-I-A-R. The lyre is an ancient instrument, a stringed instrument. And a lyric was originally a poem that was sung to the accompaniment of a lyre. So the word lyrical comes from that, and it somehow reminds us of the rustic bards. You remember these poets who went from place to place singing. They were called the bards. So these rustic bards, you think of them when you think of the word lyrical. And what about the word ballads, my dear students? The ballad, you remember, is a kind of poetry which tells a story. And most of the ballads that have come down to us from ancient times have come because of orality. You understand the word orality. That means a oral telling of the stories. Who listens to stories? The common man. You don't have to be literate to listen to a story. And therefore, the word ballad brings to your mind the idea of oral storytelling among common people. The common man, remember, my dear friends, is very important to Wordsworth and Coleridge and all the other romantic poets, in fact, all the romantic writers. You might recall Charles Lamb and his personal essay. Remember, that what they were interested in, Lamb and Hazlitt, if you please, Southey and Byron and Keats and Shelley and Wordsworth and Coleridge, the list can go on and on. All of them were interested in the common man. Look at your slide again, my dear students. So the first edition of the Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798. And it may surprise you to know that it was published anonymously. Though Wordsworth had already written a few poems, he wasn't very sure how it was going to be received, and therefore it was published anonymously. In the 1800 edition, 1800, that is 2 years later, in that edition, Wordsworth added the famous preface to the Lyrical Ballads. In the 1802 edition, there was something more, and that was an enlarged preface. What were these poems about? Why were these poems being written? Both the poets were very clear that these poems were meant to be experiments. You might wonder why these great poets wanted to talk about these poems as experiments. But my dear students, let us remember that today we talk of them as being great poems 200 years later. We talk of them as being great poets. We talk of the Romantic Age. But we must remember that when these poems were being written, the poets had no idea how they were going to be received. These poets had no idea whether the poems were going to be appreciated.